Hey, this is Tim Furnish, and you're listening to the Break It Down Show.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John and Pete.
Hey, this week on the Break It Down Show, we have quite a guest.
Tim Furnish.
Man.
I know.
The topic of our conversation this week is one that has gone on for 800 years.
Right.
And it's gone back and forth. And it's one that we need to continue to have, especially because the events in the world, well, I don't know that it's any different than it has been the whole time.
We go back a long way with this. This has been a fight for a long time. And
Yeah.
It's a religious fight, but it's also a political fight.
Well, it is. And I am an American, and I love America.
Yes.
But I have to be honest and say, we're not necessarily the good guys all the time. I mean, Iran is our enemy.
Right.
And I don't want them to kill us. But we fucked Iran.
That's right. We get pissed when they fuck us back.
Yeah.
We get really mad about
Yeah.
that.
And Syria, too.
Same thing.
Yep. So there was a revolution in Syria. They revolted against the folks we put in power there.
Yep.
And we found out that those folks were assholes.
Yeah.
And now we're not doing a great job at supporting the folks who revolted, even though they kicked the assholes out and they're fighting ISIS now.
You know, this stuff is complex. And there's, you know, in our country, we're conservative because we're so divided. And what Tim is going to probably do is show you the hardcore reality truth about Islam. People want to stone people in Islam. And it's hard to hear that, but you have to have this conversation if we're going to ever get anywhere closer to understanding each other.
Right. Yeah, because things are different.
Yeah.
So, hope you enjoy the conversation. I hope it spurs more conversation. And here he is on the Break It Down Show this week, Tim Furnish.
Tim, would you just give us your 30-second bio?
Well, let's see. I was enlisted. After college, I hated law school so much I quit and joined the Army. Wound up in the 101st as an Arabic linguist. Got out of there. Actually did a master's degree at seminary, then went and did a PhD at Ohio State in Islamic history. And while I was doing that, I actually went back in, got commissioned, went to chaplain school, was going to become a chaplain. And then it became too complex to do chaplaincy in academia, so I wound up getting out. Taught college for 7 years, and then got hooked up through some friends, well, one friend in particular here, and did consulting for 5 years at Special Operations. Done various and sundry other lecturing at other government military venues over the last decade or so.
I think in the timeline that you gave us, thing that jumped off for me was that you had been enlisted and then you got out and you completed your doctoral studies at Ohio State and then you went back in and commissioned. Is that what happened?
Right. I went to chaplain school, got a direct commission to be a chaplain because I had a seminary degree, although I was not ordained. It became an issue of becoming ordained versus academia, and it really, I bit off a bit more than I could chew at that point.
You are not a stranger to heavy subjects.
I guess that's safe to say.
Are you Presbyterian, Episcopalian? What?
Lutheran. I'm Lutheran.
Lutheran. Oh, Lutheran. We like John.
Well, let me ask you this. What is the conflict between the chaplaincy and academia?
Oh, in my case, it was just too much, although there are probably deeper ideological conflicts. But, in my case, it was just that it was a matter of, I was writing a doctoral dissertation on Islamic Eschatology, Islamic end time beliefs, trying to finish that up at Ohio State, although my wife and I had moved to the Atlanta area from Columbus, Ohio. And then, I also had, at the time, was trying to take some seminary classes down here through a consortium and then through a Lutheran seminary in South Carolina. And it was just too much. And then about that time we had our first child. So I had to sort of prioritize, and I talked to the R% Colonel Chaplain in St. Louis who said, decide academia or, chaplaincy in the military. And I wound up going with the former.
Well, that's all very practical. So I'm glad that we got the practical explanation out of you. I think what I was going for was maybe an attempt to set the table so that we could discuss the intellectual versus, I don't know, for lack of a better thing to call it, the spiritual, guiding principles that we face sometimes. I mean, we're going to talk today about the problems that face us in the Middle East, about ISIS, things like that. And a lot of times we try to dissect these things on an intellectual level, when what we have to understand is that that's really just half of the argument, if half of the argument, when it comes to understanding what our counterpoints are up against, and what, I hate to use the word enemy, but let's just use it just for the sake of, just for lack of something else to call an Islamic jihadist. What we need to do is understand.
Well, clearly I have no problem with calling them our enemy. I mean, I would say,
here I am trying to be polite.
Mm-hmm. No need. But, look, I think a better way of looking at it is not so much sort of intellectual versus practical as it is sort of the Western viewpoint, which is largely shaped by, of course, Christianity, since Christianity is not only the world's largest religion, but it's by far the predominant religion in Western civilization.
Mm-hmm.
It's the Western viewpoint, mainly a Western Christian viewpoint versus an Islamic viewpoint. And the biggest difference is this. For most people in the West, their Christianity, or whatever their religion is something that is held to be mainly in the private sphere. You are only supposed to bring it into the public sphere, sort of guardedly. I mean, witness, debates about abortion and gay rights and so on and so forth. There are many in our society who would say that any religious argument impinging on those issues is out of bounds, ipso facto out of bounds. And this goes back to that sort of a skewed idea, the relationship of the differentiation between church and state, which of course was an Enlightenment idea, came out of Europe, was first set up in the United States, where you don't have an official state church. Okay, that idea was the culmination of many centuries of debate and argument and intellectual development in primarily Western Christian society. Islam doesn't have that. For the vast majority of the world,
not happening in that side of the world.
There's no, well, yes, and there is no ideological, intellectual line of reasoning that led to the separation of mosque and state. Any place in the Islamic world where there's any even vague differentiation between the two, such as Turkey, which is maybe Indonesia to a certain extent, is borrowed. It's borrowed from Western civilization. I mean, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the Turks, Kemal Ataturk, founder of modern Turkey, just basically borrowed whole hog from the American and French Constitution. So, Bernard Lewis explains this quite ably in a number of his books, particularly the book What Went Wrong. Christianity, there's historical precedent for this. Christianity spent 3 centuries as a persecuted minority in the Roman Empire. Islam, from day one, was, on the other hand, a conquering, triumphant, successful religion. And so it became early on enmeshed in Islamic thought that you don't separate religion and politics. And that you don't have that. I mean, Muhammad never differentiated the two. That's another issue. I mean, Jesus, the famous passage in the Gospels, Jesus said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. Muhammad never said any such thing. So that has heavily imprinted both civilizations, and it's down to this day, it's gotten to the point where, many in our society, State Department, White House, intellectual circles, and frankly, far too many in the military, have imposed a Western view on Muslims. Well, we can't talk about religion. We're not going to talk about religion. That's not an issue. And that's just ridiculous.
It has to be an issue.
Well, of course, when every day, the very term jihad is a religious term. If John Brennan or Eric Holder can declare it out of bounds all they want, but that's not going to change reality. You guys know the movie, one of my favorite.
It's not out of bounds, it's enmeshed.
Yes, it's inseparable. We cannot address the issue of terrorism in the world, most of which, unfortunately, is Islamic-based terrorism, without addressing this issue. The movie, one of my favorite Westerns, the movie, if you remember this, Jeremiah Johnson with Robert Redford, 1972, sure. I think, he's the mountain man. Remember this movie?
We love Jeremiah Johnson. Absolutely.
Great movie. Well, remember the scene where Jeremiah Johnson, he's like shaved and he's got a wife and that kid and he's living in a cabin and these U.S. soldiers show up. It's supposed to be up in, Utah, the mountains of Utah or something. These U.S. soldiers show up and said, there's a wagon train stuck out there in the mountains. We got to get to it. We need you as a guide. And Johnson says, we can't go through there. You can't go straight through because it goes through sacred Crow burial land. And the minister, one of the guys with the U.S. Cavalry Detachment, is a minister, and he says, surely you don't believe that, Johnson. And Johnson says, it doesn't matter what I believe. It matters what they believe.
Amen, brother. That's exactly
and this is where we're at. I've used that line so many times, with maybe more succinct setup, with people in the military, particularly, and some government agencies, and they just look at me like I have three heads. I'm like, you can't impose, and the very people that often will preach to you about diversity and respecting other cultures will then impose their narrow view of this religion versus state and this idea of religion on other cultures, and then take umbrage when you point out that maybe that view is not correct. So that's where we're at.
Yeah,
wow.
That's a great note to play, and I usually go down the cultural road, and that's exactly right. It doesn't matter. I don't have to agree with Sharia law, but I have to understand, the mechanics of it and why someone would live under that law before I could ever hope to improve their position. I can't come in with a canned solution and just say, here's your solution in a can, because no one's going to buy that. They don't know what the hell that is. So I'm glad that you brought that in as part of the topic and covering the fact that yes, we don't have a problem. As a matter of fact, we don't even have freedom of religion. We have freedom from religion. That's just, it's not applicable in most of the rest of the world. And as soon as we can start talking there, now we have a chance at least seeing the perspectives that are predominant in the world, and then try to figure out ways to work within those systems and affect the change that we all find better.
Right. But, precious few are doing that. You know what it's like. You're not supposed to talk about religion. Or we'll hide it under the guise of culture. And I will grant you that the two are, tightly intertwined, but they are not coterminous. There are differences. There are things that you can clearly point out come from, for instance, the Quran or the Hadiths, the alleged sayings of Muhammad, extra Quranic. And there are things that are cultural. So the two can be differentiated. You can't just subsume them under the same category and pretend you're not talking about religion, which again is sort of what a lot of folks like to do.
I think especially from our view and how we see the world. First, I would say I would define culture just because it's so tough to do. I work from the model of saying anything that can't be explained by DNA is explained by culture. So that would put religion as a subset. But in our case, I think religion is its own unique thing because it is so dangerous to us. We don't like to mess with it in a public setting, as you were saying before. And you do. So one of the things that I try to put forward from my work I've experienced is we have to win fights, modern fights, of course, militarily, and we're very good at that. But we also have to win socially, politically, culturally, and with religion. Because if you can't leverage religion, you can't win. You won't win. Matter of fact, you'll get trounced.
Well, I'm not sure if I totally agree you can't leverage it.
Well, I think you can. I think you should
exploit it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you have to. I think you have to win. I'm saying we don't do it well. We don't ever think about it. I'm not trying to weaponize religion, but absolutely. Yeah, you have to think of it that way. And how do you work within the confines of Islam to use it in your advantage? And I'll give you an example. I worked with a Jordanian colonel who obviously is Islamic. And this is for the time in Afghanistan, one of the many times when we did something dumb and the Quran was in a trash pile and we burned it. It was, either on purpose or not, it didn't matter. It hurts people from the Islamic world and it makes us look like assholes. Well, meanwhile, he said, every time the Taliban goes around and burns a school down to the ground, there's a Quran in that school. Don't let those guys send this message out without that response, because it's absolutely true. They're doing the same thing.
Well, and that's a very good point. I hadn't been aware of that. That's a good point to make. He was very, very perspicacious there. But I wrote an article too on this topic. In fact, I think I wrote 3 or 4 articles. This was after the burning. Was it Bagram?
That's right.
Back in 2010 or so. Yeah, it was an issue of where they had, I believe it was a detention center / prison, and some of the prisoners were supposedly taking the Qurans out of the library and writing notes to each other, allegedly about, escape plans or something. And so the CO or whomever told some poor E4 to take them out and burn them, which right away was kind of stupid. Why don't you get a local imam to take care of that instead of doing it that way? You would have thought that's where a little bit of cultural sensitivity could go a long way. But I wrote several articles on that, and it took me about, 15 seconds to find a Saudi fatwa that had been published in Saudi Arabia, on the permissibility of burning Qurans when they've been defaced. Technically speaking, according to the hardcore Wahhabi Salafi viewpoint, simply writing in a Quran makes it defaced.
Right.
So I'm glad no one comes in my study and looks at the ones that I have, both Arabic and English, because I've written all over them. But that's okay because I'm not a Muslim. But anyway, first of all, it is simply wrong that it is a grave blasphemy to burn Qurans in Islamic thought because, as I said, there's a Saudi fatwa that says it's legal if they've been defaced, and clearly the ones from this detention center have been defaced. Again, I would not have had, some poor before do it. I would have talked to the local imam and say, how should we dispose of these and what should be done with them? But secondly, also in Islamic history, the third caliph, Uthman, famously ordered Qurans burned that contradicted the official canonical version that he had set up. A little bit of different context, but I mean, just being aware of this. I mean, rather than cowering before, as pretty much everyone in the chain of command did, cowering before people who intimidate you by saying that, you've offended against Islam, have some knowledge and say, well, wait a minute, Again, I think I would have punted it over to an imam or a cleric or someone in Afghanistan that has a bit more knowledge, but still, it's sort of like that argument about this whole debate about images in Islam, right? And the whole thing with the shooting in Garland and leaving aside whether or not one thinks that Pam Geller and the folks on that side of the fence are being intentionally provocative. I think we could all agree they don't deserve to get shot for it. But I mean, a lot of people that opine on this just accept line, hook, and sinker and everything, that the idea, the actually fundamentalist Islamic idea that you can't ever show images of Muhammad. Really? Well, again, do about 15 seconds of Googling and you can find all kinds of images from the Islamic world, from the 15th century and the 14th century and the 16th century, in the Ottoman Empire, in the Timurid Empire, in the Mughal Empire in India, that show Muhammad. Now, it's fallen out of favor in recent years, but the fact is that even in Islam, for many centuries, it was perfectly permissible to show Muhammad as well as other prophets. So when a media or an intel analyst or someone in a three-letter agency accepts at face value the idea that you can't show images of Islam as sort of grave insult to Muslim, they're basically taking ipso facto, they're taking the fundamentalist Salafi Wahhabi view and imposing that on people. And that's just insane because that would be like representing Christianity by taking the most narrow, I don't know, I used to be a Southern Baptist, I'll use a Southern Baptist, by taking the most narrow Southern Baptist view of something and saying that stands for all of Christianity, which is absurd.
Yeah, that is absurd. Hey, I want to try to change gears a little bit so we don't get too far down this road. And you talked about the third caliph, and one of the terms we hear a lot, and I don't know if anybody's taken the time to explain it, is the caliphate and the importance of establishing a caliphate in Islam. Can you just give us a real brief 5 minutes or so on the caliphate and why it matters?
Caliphate was the institution that had sprung up after the death of Muhammad, basically institutionalizing two of the three roles that Muhammad held. Khalifa means successor. Muhammad basically held three roles, one of which ended, according to most mainstream Muslims, but not all, which was the role of prophecy. The other two roles that he held were political leader, a king basically, and military leader, commander. Those two roles continued, and they were subsumed under the caliphate. And basically the caliph was more or less an emperor. There was a bit of sort of religious legitimacy to the caliph, of course, particularly the Sunni caliph, the caliph is mainly a Sunni institution. And it basically, you were chosen, it was sort of like a 7th century version of the Soviet Politburo. It wasn't popularly elected or anything. You had the 12 or 15 or 20 top guys, companions of Muhammad when he was alive, and key military commanders who chose of their own ranks the caliph, basically. And that went on for a while, but then they had a split very early on, had civil wars about who should be the caliph. A group called the Shi'at Ali, the faction of Ali, basically a minority group basically split away and said that Ali, who was Muhammad's closest male relative and Muhammad's son-in-law, also married Muhammad's daughter, he was cousin of Muhammad who married Muhammad's daughter, should have been the first caliph. Muhammad had no sons, although having, according to most sources, as many as 11 wives and no sons. This being 7th century Arabia, they're not going to put a woman in charge. So Ali did not become caliph until several other guys had been caliph before him. This was in 656 AD. He was assassinated after 5 years, which set off a whole other round of Islamic civil wars. And it basically settled down into eventually the majority group, the Sunnis, continued to have caliphs through different dynasties from different parts of what was the conquered Islamic lands. The Umayyads from mainly the Umayyads from Syria, and then after 750 AD, a group from what is now Eastern Iran, Western Afghanistan, called the Abbasids. They took over, ruled till about 1250 AD, 1258 actually. They were conquered by the Mongols, and at which time the caliphate was really wiped out. The caliph and all of his family were killed by the Mongols. So the caliphate went into abeyance. It was resurrected later by the Ottoman Turks, of course. And then the Ottoman Caliphate ended in, not prior with World War I, the early 1920s. The Ottoman Caliphate was dissolved by the Turkish state, and there has not been a caliph since. There have also been other minor caliphs over the years in various and sundry places that proclaimed themselves the caliphs. But the main ones, of course, in history are the ones I just outlined. Now the 12 are Shia. The Shiites go a different way. The Shiites, as I mentioned earlier, believed that you had to be a descendant of Muhammad, a male descendant of Muhammad, through Ali, to be what they called not the caliph, but the imam. But they believed that there was a line of these guys. There were 12 of them, and the last of them was a young boy. Really, if you look at it historically, he probably almost certainly, he died in the 9th century AD, but that would have wiped out that branch of the Islamic religion. So they came up with this sort of contrived and very convoluted argument that he did not, the 12th Imam, as they call him, did not die, that went into something called ghaiba in Arabic, which is occultation, eclipse, the same word you use for an eclipse of the moon. He never died. He went into sort of a parallel dimension or something. And he will return at the end of time, according to the 12 Shia of Iran and Iraq and a few other places, as the 12th Imam al-Mahdi, the eschatological apocalyptic end of time figure. So that's sort of the differentiation in political power between the two major branches of Islam. Again, the caliphate, what many Muslims believe to have been the legitimate caliphate was the one resurrected by the Ottomans, and again, which disappeared at the end of World War I, really early 1920s. And this is the one that, for instance, bin Laden used to bemoan the dissolution of. But this is, of course, now the argument about how legitimate is ISIS's caliphate, because ISIS claims to have brought back the caliphate, in Raqqa, I guess.
Why does the caliphate matter so much? What makes it important to us in the Western world? Why should we care about it?
Why should we care about it?
Yeah.
Or why do Muslims care about it?
No. Why should we care? Why is it important to us? Why is it going to affect our lives that ISIS has stood up this proclaimed caliphate?
Well, it's important to us because it has a great deal of historical and theological resonance for Muslims. Even Muslims that don't support the brutality of an ISIS can get behind the idea of a caliphate. Again, it has a great deal of legitimacy in Islam. It would be sort of roughly analogous as if, say, the papacy had been wiped out at some point in history, and then Catholics wanted to bring it back. Although, of course, the caliphate is much more political than the caliphate has been in the last 500 years. It's sort of roughly analogous to that. So it's important because it appeals not just to the jihadists and the ISIS types, the Boko Harams and the Talibans and the Al Qaedas and so on and so forth, but it has a great deal of resonance for mainstream Muslims. And this, I think, is sort of most analysts and journalists tend to sort of dismiss the ISIS caliphate, because a lot of Muslims will say, of course, if you're the king of Jordan or the king of Saudi Arabia or, the president of Turkey, you're of course going to dismiss a rival political power like that, especially one that's claiming legitimacy from Muhammad himself. But among rank and file Muslims, I would argue it has a great deal of credibility. I mean, again, not ISIS's per se, but the caliphate itself. And I think that some of that legitimacy that the caliphate as an institution has for many, 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 if not most Muslims, particularly Sunnis, is sort of rubbing off on ISIS a little bit. Again, you've seen many polls that a lot of people and a lot of Muslims don't support ISIS. But then you also look at Pew data, for instance, from like the 2012 study that Pew did. There were many questions about across, I believe, 36 different Muslim countries. To what degree do people support Sharia law? To what degree do people support brutal aspects of Sharia law, like, for instance, stoning for adultery? And if you look in many Muslim countries, this is, politically incorrect and not very nice, but it's true. The data shows that many Muslims, large minorities, and in fact majorities in some countries, support things like stoning for adultery and killing people for quote unquote apostatizing, leaving Islam. And where are those laws? Well, there are a number of countries where they have those as the penalties. I think there's 7 Islamic countries. There's 7 countries on earth that have the death penalty for homosexual behavior, and all of them are Islamic countries. Which, curiously enough, I never hear President Obama talk about. But anyway, my point is that although the ISIS caliphate is poo-pooed by many Muslims as sort of, not legitimate, if you look at the data on some of the behaviors of what they do in ISIS in terms of enacting brutally, yes, but enacting in every jot and tittle Islamic law as it's been understood in history, particularly Sharia punishments, you find that there are large numbers of millions, tens of millions of Muslims that actually support those sorts of punishments that ISIS is imposing on people. So I would argue that the legitimacy of the ISIS caliphate sort of draws strength from a couple things. One is, again, just the idea of the caliphate in general. And there's a place on earth, a territorial state, and this was brilliant of ISIS, much more brilliant than Al-Qaeda, to declare a territorial state and not just hide in the shadows somewhere. And also to impose Quranic and Sharia laws, again, brutally, but literally, and thus be able to claim sort of the high ground in terms of a theological justification.
So let me just make sure I understand what you're saying. You're saying that ISIS has created a caliphate, a state, maybe similar to the Vatican, and while their brand of Islam might be more extreme and more lethal than a lot of the world can stomach, the fact of the matter is this: they're going to draw a lot of Islamic backing and support, because even though it's a more extreme version of Islam, it's still Islam. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not sure that I would agree that it's an extreme version of Islam. Again, go look at the Pew data from 2012. Huge majorities of people in Egypt, in Jordan, in various and sundry other Muslim countries, Nigeria, Pakistan, support the death penalty for apostasy from Islam. Huge majorities. I think it's like 74% or something in Egypt.
Wow.
Now, so there's, and large majorities support stoning for adultery. Remember the hue and cry a while back of the video of ISIS stoning a woman to death? Yes, it's very unpalatable for us, but again, the data, unless you're one of these, I have some conspiracy theory Muslim friends that think Pew fabricated all the data, which I really don't believe. Pew's generally nonpartisan and pretty good. They polled Muslims in these countries, and these large majorities, again, not in all Muslim countries, but in a number of them, said we support this. So if stoning for adultery or killing someone for leaving the religion is supported by a majority of people, and there is scriptural backup for it, I don't understand how it can be called extremist. It's, to me, not extremist.
I just want to say, how about, the large numbers of people in and I'm just pulling out of my sleeve, Texas or Tennessee or Arkansas or wherever, who believe that homosexuality is a sin, that doesn't mean they're running to the Westboro Baptist Church to join up.
Well, no, that's true. But there is no, in Christianity, in the New Testament, there is no penalty given for homosexuality. It's simply called a sin. In the Quran and the Hadith, the punishment for homosexuality is spelled out. It's death.
And it's supported by a lot of people.
Yes, again, Pew data 2012. Again, I always tell people it's like when I tell people about what the Quran says or Hadith says. I'm like, well, I didn't make this up. Dick Cheney's staff didn't make this up. It's there.
Yeah.
And the reason why, again, look, the reason why I think this is just totally overlooked by analysts. They keep wanting to try to find the attraction of ISIS in their brilliant social media movement or how cool their tweets are or something. Okay, that's process. That's not substance. This process would not have any salience if there weren't some substance behind it. Like beheading. Okay, I don't know if you guys know this, but I wrote. Unfortunately, I'm too well known for this. I wrote probably the only academic article that's ever been written on beheading in Islam. 2005, Middle East Quarterly, beheading in the name of Islam. And I talk about this, and I talked about this. A lot of people wanted to talk to me about this last summer when ISIS first popped up on the radar screen last summer, last fall. They're beheading all those people. Why are they doing this? I don't understand. Well, because there are two major passages of the Quran, Surah Al-Anfal, verse 12, I believe it is, and Surah Al-Muhammad, verses 3 and 4, that say, behead the unbelievers when you encounter them on the battlefield. So what ISIS does by beheading these guys, does it horrify a lot of Muslims? Yes, but obviously there are a number of Muslims it doesn't horrify at all, because what ISIS says, and they have some legitimacy to be in doing so, ISIS says, we are the real Muslims. We are taking what the Quran says, applying it today, doing it literally. For that matter, by the way, just so you may not know, but Saudi Arabia actually beheads more people than ISIS does. It's just state versus sort of quasi-state beheading. But this idea that beheading is some sort of like new horror that ISIS just invented out of the clear blue is just, again, truly ignorant because, again, they're applying. Look at the Dabiq magazines that ISIS publishes, and I've gone through most of them, with a fine-tooth comb. ISIS quotes the Quran and quotes the Hadiths, the alleged sayings of Muhammad, dozens, probably hundreds of times if you add up all these magazines. Now, do they have a certain understanding? Yes, they have a very literalist understanding. They have what, when I was in graduate school, we were still allowed to call the Islamic fundamentalist understanding. But it is in no wise extremist. It is not extremist to wage jihad in Islamic history. Muhammad himself waged jihad. It is not extremist to behead people, to behead your enemies, because not only did Muhammad order it done, but if you look at the major Islamic polities across space and time, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Ottomans, some of the ones I mentioned earlier, they beheaded enemies right and left. So it's only people that are truly ignorant of history or that live in a society like ours that are totally removed from this sort of brutality, do we find such a thing inexplicable. If you adopt the ISIS mindset, which is, again, Quranic literalism and applying 7th century standards imposed by Muhammad today, it's not inexplicable at all. It makes perfect sense.
Yeah, it does make perfect sense, and that's a good jumping off point to have you talk a little bit about hot wiring the apocalypse. I'd love to have you kind of break that down for us, too.
Yeah, that's a wonderful phrase. It was invented by a just recently deceased, very, very, very brilliant Israeli scholar called Reuben Paz, who worked at, in fact, he headed up and started, I believe, what was called PRISM, the Project for the Research of Islamist Movements. It was at Herzliya in Israel. Reuben came up with this idea probably about 10 years ago. Hot wiring the apocalypse, and for those, there are about probably 12 of us weird guys, mainly in the United States, a couple of Israelis and a couple of others that study Islamic eschatology, Islamic end time stuff. Hot wiring the apocalypse means groups, mainly Muslim, but not necessarily only Muslim, that attempt to cause the apocalyptic moment to arrive, to attempt to cause, if you will, sort of the end of the world, although I hate to use that terminology because, again, that's a very Christian view. The apocalypse in Islam doesn't necessarily mean the end of the world. The apocalypse in Islam, and by the way, the word apocalypse literally in Greek means the unveiling. You know, the last book of the New Testament is called the Revelation or the Apocalypse of St. John. It was revealed, it was the passages and the visions of the end of time that were revealed to St. John on the island of Patmos. So apocalypse literally means unveiling, revealing of something, but of course, if you use the term, for most of us, you think of like mushroom clouds and that sort of thing. So I try to use more often the term eschatological, which means from the Greek word eschaton, the end. It means the study of the end. In Islamic eschatology in particular, the apocalypse or the eschaton does not mean the end of time, because what it means is that whether you're Sunni or Shia, because they both have this belief, although it's slightly different, in both Sunni and Shia thought, Allah will send the Mahdi, M-A-H-D-I, the rightly guided one, who is the primary end time or eschatological figure for Islam. And Jesus will also be sent back because, as you probably know, but some people don't, in the Quran, it says Jesus was a Muslim prophet, not the Son of God, not the second person of the Trinity, which of course the Quran explicitly denies. And the Quran, of course, also denies crucifixion and thus the resurrection. Jesus was taken in heaven. Before he was crucified, he will come back. He and the Mahdi will basically work together, more or less to conquer the world and make the whole world Muslim. And so this idea of hotwiring the apocalypse is this idea of some groups, and when we're talking about an Islamic context, what we're talking about is groups that think you can do something to sort of force Allah's hand into sending the Mahdi. And this is an idea that I first ran across when I was writing my doctoral dissertation and then my first book, Holiest Wars, which came out 10 years ago. I found that some folks in Al-Qaeda seem to believe this. They seem to believe that particularly horrific attacks against the United States would help sort of advance the timetable for Allah sending the Mahdi. This idea, I think, is still there, and I think it's one of the ideas that's driving ISIS. I think I've studied ISIS quite a bit. I think it's clear that the brutality with which they kill people, not just the beheadings, but the burnings alive, and also the reimposition of slavery on the Yazidi women, as well as the reimposition of dhimmi or second-class status on Christians in areas they control. All of that is aimed at basically hotwiring the apocalypse. They talk at length, especially in the first 5 issues of Dabiq magazine, their magazine, which comes out, every couple of months. They talk about, in fact, the very name of that magazine, Dabiq, is the name of that town in northwestern Syria near the Turkish border, where, according to a major hadith or tradition from Muhammad, the main apocalyptic battle between Muslims and Christians will take place before the end of time. And right after that battle, which the Muslims believe they will win, according to the hadith, the Mahdi will appear. So I believe that a whole lot, and I've been writing about this really since last summer, a whole lot of what ISIS is doing is predicated on this idea of hotwiring the apocalypse. So the other major place you get the hotwiring the apocalypse idea is with Iran. Now this is where I differ with many of my conservative brethren on this issue. I do not think that hotwiring the apocalypse is an active idea in Iranian 12er Shia theology. Sort of the Cliff Notes version of this is this idea, and I'm sure you've heard it and read it. It's all over the media. It's very rampant among many in the Republican Party. The idea that Iran wants a nuclear weapon because they're going to, as soon as they get it, they're going to nuke Tel Aviv because they believe that will cause the return of the 12th Imam. The Mahdi figure for them. And I've been studying Iranian 12er Shia theology for a number of years. I've actually been to Iran once, believe it or not, back in 2008 to a conference. And I think that neither a study of 12er Shiism nor a study of modern Iranian geopolitics supports the idea that Iran wants to do this. I think Iran wants nukes, that's clear. I think they'll lie to anybody to get nukes, but I think they want them just for regime insurance. and to give them added clout. I don't think they're stupid enough, and again, I don't think there's any religious justification if you look at their brand of Islam for this idea, to use them against Israel, because they know what would happen about, I don't know what's the flight time from the Negev to Iran? 18, 20 minutes?
Yeah, not far.
For ICBMs. Yeah, the Iranians are not stupid. So basically the hotline the apocalypse idea, again, I think it's active, particularly among the Sunni extremist groups like ISIS and some elements of Al-Qaeda, maybe even Boko Haram and some of these other groups. But I don't think it's active among the Iranians.
Well, here's the thing that makes me curious, being that we live in the West, I want the West to survive. So, is there any sort of ending that would be acceptable to include both of us? I mean, it seems like everything points toward, whether you're trying to hotwire the apocalypse or not, everything points toward, well, the whole world's got to be Muslim or something.
Well, see, yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, is there any opening for harmony?
Yeah, I think there is. But look, it's going to be a matter of decades, at least, I think. Look, if you look, I used to teach college world history. You know, in world history, you take a really big picture. And I'm a fan, although, you know, most liberals are not, I'm a fan of Huntington's famous book, The Clash of Civilizations, which I think was exactly right. And the thesis of that, which came out in I think 89 or 90 now, he was writing it as the Soviet Union was collapsing, and his thesis was, Huntington, eminent political scientist, I believe, at Harvard, his thesis was that once the sort of artificial division of the world into communist and non-communist blocks went away with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Yeah, the People's Republic of China is officially communist, but they aren't sort of, hegemonic in terms of the whole world about it like the Soviets were. Once the Soviet Union went away and communism as sort of a global movement went away, the world would revert to sort of a 19th century, pre-20th century division into cultural blocks, and the cultural blocks are pretty much along religious lines, the Christian world, and we divided into the Protestant world, the Catholic world, and, the Orthodox world, if you want to consider Russia sort of an Orthodox place, which in many ways it is, neo-Orthodox under Putin. China, communist, but also very strongly influenced by Confucianism, South Asia, India, a Hindu bloc, so on and so forth. And of course, Huntington said that the major zone of conflict would be between the Islamic world and the others, because the Islamic world, again, to go back to what we started talking about some time ago, the Islamic world has never accepted key elements of modernity. And one of the key elements of modernity, which pretty much every civilizational bloc, regardless of religious background, has accepted except them, is the idea that you can to some degree separate church and state, or, I guess if we want to talk about Hindu civilization, temple and state. Islam has not accepted that. There's one global civilization, unfortunately, that does not work and play well with others. That's the Islamic one. And part of this, of course, the major part of this, Muslims and many people on the left will try to blame it on Western imperialism. Well, some people on the extreme right too. I mean, what Ron Paul always said, that our problems with the Islamic world were our own faults. As if, although you can never get a Ron Paul supporter to explain to you how it was the United States' fault when Muhammad invaded the Byzantine Empire when the United States didn't exist, but I digress. So the Islamic world, because of the intrinsic ideas of, religion and state, Islam and state have to be together. And anywhere there's more than about 3 Muslims, you really need Sharia law and that sort of thing. It's the Islamic world that has to sort of come to grips with modernity and be able to accept, peacefully the idea of living as, say, minorities in non-Muslim countries and that sort of thing. And on the reverse side of that, Islam has a really bad track record of tolerating its own minorities. And again, to sort of circle around to what you asked me about originally, here's our hope. There are Islamic sects, S-E-C-T-S, which together probably number about 100 million. I mean, that's a small minority, small percentage of the 1.5 billion Muslims, but that's still a fair number. There are Islamic sects that have given up on jihad. For instance, there's a group called the Ahmadis. They're followers of a guy named Ghulam Ahmad Shah who lived in British India, died in 1908. The Ahmadis believe that this guy was not just the Mahdi, but also the returned Jesus, rolled into one. And you'll often see, particularly Ahmadi guys on TV commenting about how jihad is not Islamic. Well, it's kind of like asking a nice Mormon chap to come and tell you about Catholic theology. It's interesting, but it's really not relevant. But anyway, the point remains, there are about 15 or 20 million Ahmadis. And they, if you read their official documents, their founder, they're considered rank heretics by Muslims because they believe that this guy was a prophet almost on the level of Muhammad. But in his writings, he said jihad is no longer viable. Violent jihad is not viable. Okay, now this is the idea of abandoning violent jihad is one of the things that gets the Ahmadis labeled rank heretics, because in mainstream, particularly Sunni Islam, jihad has never been abandoned. It's still very activist and very salient. Again, as I said earlier, it's not extremist to wage jihad at all. It's very mainstream. But there are sects like that. The second largest sect of the Shia, it's a group called the Ismailis. They're also called Sevener Shias because they believe there were 7 imams after Muhammad rather than 12. So you can't explain that without a flow chart. So I'm not sure I can explain that on the radio. But anyway, they're the second largest branch of the Shia. They're headed by a very rich chap called the Aga Khan, whom you might have heard of. They also are very peaceful. They have abandoned jihad. They define jihad as things like building desalinization plants in East Africa and building schools. So there are sects of Islam that have come to terms with modernity and that have rejected really what are really sort of the pre-modern, unsavory aspects, of some of what's in the Quran and the Hadith. But until such a time as they are accepted instead of persecuted, they are persecuted in places like Indonesia and Pakistan. Yemen, for that matter. There are Ismailis in Yemen and Saudi Arabia who are persecuted. So until such a time as Islam evolves, if you will, to the point where those guys and gals can be tolerated without risking their lives by simply expressing their opinions or building a mosque somewhere, this problem is going to continue. But again, it's a major world religion. It's the second largest world religion, 1.5, 1.6 billion. The only one bigger is Christianity with about 2.2 billion. And it took Christians a long time to get to the point where they weren't killing each other in the name of Christianity. The 30 Years' War in Europe, 1618, 1648, killed millions of people. And that was when the best thing you had was a musket. And the 30 Years' War, which was mainly between Protestants and Catholics in the wake of the Reformation, although Protestants and Catholics would get together to kill Anabaptists who drove everybody crazy. But it took 30 years and millions of deaths in Europe before Europeans finally decided, let's try not to kill each other in the name of religion. All right, well, going forward, we'll kill each other in the name of the nation state, but not religion, because it's too easy to do it in the name of religion. So, obviously it didn't stop in 1648, but it took centuries for Christianity to get to the point, Christian civilization to get to the point where where religion was pushed, sort of out of, maybe not out of the public sphere, but out of politics to a certain extent. And again, Christianity had the advantage of being able to differentiate, again, going back to Christ, as I said earlier, give to Caesar what is Caesar and to God what is God. It's harder for Islam because you can't make that argument based on anything Muhammad said. You have to make the argument, on other terms, or you have to borrow the idea from Christianity, which right away drives, the fundamentalist Muslims like the Salafis up a wall because they don't want to borrow anything from another religious culture. So I do think there's hope. There are strands within Islam that I think are much more tolerant and that are truly moderate. Are they minorities? Yes. But I think that their ideas, especially in the West, are gaining credibility. But again, it's going to be a long-term thing, and it's not going to be defined by, President Obama or any American president. is not going to be defined by Western politicians, Cameron or Obama or Holder or anybody else telling Muslims what is and is not real Islam. It's going to have to be done by Muslims themselves.
Okay, fair enough. I agree with that point, but I wonder though, and I'll wonder aloud and then ask for your comment. You know, we talked earlier about how Islam is both a religion and a political movement. So, what does the end look like if I can just paint that picture with a broad stroke, if there's an end to conflict and a beginning of harmony? Is it that, again, I'm wondering aloud, and then I'm going to ask you for comment. Is it that Islam is more a religion and that over time it moderates toward creating harmony? Or is it more of a political movement and over time they become like, say, the Nazis, where they were wrong and we have to kick their ass, and then they have to put their tail between their legs and go, wow, we sure did get that wrong. Hey, everybody, we're sorry.
Well, I think it's a parallel development because it's happening now. In fact, it's been happening for a while in the Islamic world. The other major branch of Islam that I didn't talk about, which is kind of hard to explain, it's not a branch like Sunni or Shia. It's sort of a movement that crosses the other two branches. It's called Sufism, or the Sufis. The Sufis have been around for, at least a millennium.
I'm a fan of the Sufis, by the way.
Yeah, I am too. Except keep in mind, however, they're not all, peace and light gurus. I mean, some of the worst jihads in Islamic history have been led by Sufis. For instance, Muhammad Ahmed
Well, that's terrible
in Sudan.
News, because all the ones I know are poets and artists and, all the
a lot of them are.
A
lot of them are, but again, if you look at Islamic history, and like for instance in my book Holiest Wars, I talked about 8 different chaps who declared themselves the Mahdi across the space of a millennium or so, and 6 of the 8 were Sufis. Because the whole mystical idea of the Mahdi, whom Allah is sending to deliver the Islamic world, meshes quite well with a lot of Sufi mystical beliefs. But that said, certainly in the last probably century and a half, maybe two centuries, there's been a growing differentiation between basically political and non-political Islam, generally speaking. And generally on the non-political side, we put the Sufis. The Sufis do tend to say Islam is a matter of my personal devotion, my personal piety vis-a-vis Allah. It depends on my prayer. It depends on my good deeds. It doesn't depend on me, controlling the society and imposing Sharia on other people. It starts with me. Now, not all Sufis believe that, but many Sufis do. And opposed to them in many Muslim countries are a strand within Sunni Islam particularly called the Salafism. Salaf refers to, it means the pious ancestors. The Salaf, the Salafis, they claim to be trying to live like the community around Muhammad, in the 7th century, before he died. They're political, and there are various strands of Salafis. I mean, for instance, of course, the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia are probably the most well-known brand of the Salafis. The Taliban are a type of Salafi, of course, but they come from another tradition in the Salafi tradition in South Asia called the Deobandism, which started in the 19th century. So the Salafis generally are sort of Islamic fundamentalists who want to be involved in the political arena very much. Sufis are not. And these two, for centuries in the Islamic world, have not liked each other. You'll see that a lot of places, like if you look at the news reports about like Al-Shabaab or any of the ISIS or Ansar al-Sharia groups in Libya, Boko Haram does this in Nigeria. Do they kill non-Muslims? Yes, but whom do they often go after? They go after Sufis. You see, they blow up Sufi shrines. They desecrate Sufi graveyards. The Sufis believe in revering their sheikhs, revering the pious ancestors. I mean, literally with relics and tombs like, Catholic pilgrimages, for instance. The Sufis do that. Salafis, Wahhabis believe that's a gross misunderstanding of Islam. They call it bid'ah. Bid'ah means shirk. It means innovation. It means that you're doing something that they don't think that the Quran mandates. So anyway, trying to answer your question, basically, we're seeing the differentiation. It's a movement that started centuries ago, and I think is picking up steam today between sort of political and non-political. The Sufis, not all of them, but the Sufis do tend to be non-political and believe that Islam is a matter of personal devotion. Salafis, Islamic fundamentalists, for that matter, the Islamic Republic of Iran are on the other side, although Iran's a different issue than Salafi, but they believe much the same thing in terms of politics, with the idea of the clerics being in charge, the Vilayat Faqih. But you're seeing this differentiation, broadly speaking, between the world's Muslims. And you were asking, how does that, what side we have to come down on? And clearly, I think, we have to be on the side of the Sufis. It's clearly the case. I mean, for instance, we have been openly supporting, there's a Sufi group in Somalia called Ahl al-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, which is sort of a pan-umbrella group of several different Sufi orders. And they've been fighting al-Shabaab for years. And we at one point were supplying weapons. Now, Sufis generally are peaceful, but they're not pacifists. I mean, they're willing, if the Salafis are digging up their graveyards and blowing up their sheikhs' tombs, they're going to take an AK-47 and go stop it. Okay? I mean, they don't just sit around and meditate. But again, there is that difference, which I explained earlier. And I think it's a matter, again, of decades. I hate to say it, but maybe even another century or two before hopefully the side of the Sufis will get the upper hand. But, I think it's a trend that in some ways we can help, some ways we can assist. But it's not something that ultimately we can decide. But I do think there's hope in that regard because, see, I disagree with, I have a lot of conservative friends and, some of them analysts and writers who say that there's no such thing as moderate Islam. It's just, it's just this fundamentalist and that's true Islam. And like, well, the literalist Islam is the sort of historical paradigm, but there have always been exceptions to that. And again, I see the trend accelerating. There is moderate Islam in some of these sects I mentioned, as well as in many of the Sufi orders. And ultimately, I think that, with the rest of the world kind of dragging that portion, particularly of the Islamic world, along into the modern world, kicking and screaming, I think that Islam will change. But it's not going to happen quickly. And in the meantime, as you correctly observed, we can't give up on the Connecticut. No, we can't give up on Connecticut. I'm sorry about that.
God
we can't
save
give up
Connecticut.
on the kinetic activities against the people that want to kill us and want to impose Sharia law on non-Muslims. You can't. It's remember a couple weeks ago the president said that you can't defeat an ideology with drones. No, but that doesn't mean you give up on the drones. You just add something to the drone activity, which is ideological warfare.
All right, so we've been at this for about an hour. John, what questions do you have before we wrap this thing up?
I don't have any questions. I just appreciate the conversation, Tim, and what a fascinating take and the level of depth that you've given us today. I really appreciate it.
Sure, glad to do it.
Yeah, it's.
I think there's a humanity that you spoke to that. And you spoke to the violence in the Quran and the literal interpretation, and the punishments and all of those things. But, still there's a humanity there that we have to understand and in order to understand the motivations of the folks who are trying to kill us.
Yeah.
Right. And let me hasten to add too, I hope this came through in what I said in my stuff about modern Islam. I'm not one of these people that thinks everything in Islam is negative. I think there's a lot of good stuff in Islam. Unfortunately, I mean, what happened with Islam was the sort of martial proclivities of a 7th century chap got ingrained, into this religion and became paradigmatic for so many people. I guess you could say that about all religions, but again, even if I weren't a Christian, I think I could have enough objectivity to say, look at the life of Muhammad, the life of Jesus, and the life of Buddha.
Yeah.
One of those is not like the others.
Yeah.
That is a terrific way to boil down. I love that you said that. That's a terrific way to boil that down. And, I want my mind and my heart to be open to all solutions and hope for harmony and all of those things. And like you, I believe that with enough time, we will get there. But there is a difference that I think is going to require some people to get over. I mean, and I don't make comparisons to Nazis lightly, but, if you went into the German countryside and stumbled upon a family of, normal people in Nazi Germany, hey, the Nazis said you ought to obey your parents and you ought to love people around you and all of that too. They left out the part about, well, a lot of parts that they should have left out. But therein lies the difference. I mean, there is a lot of good stuff about Islam as a faith, and I hope those things shine through and we all figure out how to get along.
Right, and again, I think the road to harmony is a long one. I think in the short term, the best we can hope for is the road to sort of mutual coexistence. And frankly, again, as I said earlier, in Islam, most of that applies within their own house, because Islam is very intolerant, both Sunni and Twelver Shia, toward its own minorities. And until that changes, I mean, first you got to get your own house in order. Muslims need to be able to tolerate, Sunni Muslims need to be able to tolerate Ahmadis and Ismailis and these other people, some of these Sufis that I talked about, and stop persecuting and killing them before they can move on to, dealing with Christians and Jews. So, again, it's a matter of years. I think we can encourage we could do a much better job than we do of encouraging the folks that I think are, frankly, the more peaceful kind of Muslims, like the Sufis and the Ahmadis and such. I think, particularly this administration had gone astray with some of the people they support. I mean, Muslim Brotherhood was probably not the best way to go. But, hopefully that will change. And we at some point, ultimately, as I said, the best we can hope for is to encourage the sort of trends within the Islamic world that are conducive to mutual coexistence. And then, the actual heavy lifting of reforming Islam, so that again, that civilization works and plays well with others, or at least better than it does, is going to be up to Muslims.
The other thing too, a little perspective on history. Christianity wasn't the kindest religion 600 years ago either, and maybe Islam just has to work through its nexus of violence before it can get there. And I propose that we start a new sect, Tim, you and I, the 13ers. We're going to wait for Musa al-Sadr's return, and in the meantime, we're going to focus on sweet, sweet love.
That's right. Musa al-Sadr is one of the possibilities for the occulted Imam. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know John's already a convert, so John's into the sweet, sweet
I'm
love.
for it.
He's a 13er. I love it. Hey, well, thanks for coming on the Break It Down show. I can almost guarantee you that we're going to be calling you back and wanting you to come back on, because we're just scratching the surface on this stuff. And you're helping us answer the question of why. And there's probably still some more why to cover, and there's a whole lot of how do we improve, how do we get going forward. And it'd be great to have you back on. Just again, from John and I both, thank you very much, and we do appreciate it.
And I
You're
think
welcome.
if I may interject one thing, Tim, I am so, I really wish, and I hope that you'll let us look you up if we ever find our way down to the Atlanta area, because so much of what you said created reaction, and we're not in the same room. So, I think that adds a dynamic, and I'd love to, at some point, get the opportunity to do this with microphones in front of us sitting around a table.
Sure. I'm out in the red part of the state, about 30 miles northwest of Atlanta, but let me know.
Yeah, and if you're ever in California also, you've got an open invite to the studio.
Terrific.
All right, thanks a lot, Tim. I appreciate it.
Thank you.